This next couple of videos will introduce us to the brainstem region and want to talk about some of the general features related to the brainstem. Remember, the brainstem itself consists of the midbrain structure here, the pons, and the medulla. Those are the three basic areas of the brainstem. And what do we already know about the brainstem in our studies so far is in terms of what will pass through it and what will it contain. We've already talked about some of the structures that pass through, such as all the sensory and motor tracts that are going from the cortex to the spinal cord. We've talked about those. And what we need to really unfold in more detail is what it contains with regard to all the nuclei and how the brainstem relates to cranial nerve function. So the basic functions of the brainstem, that's going to be a conduit for the continuation of descending motor tracts, ascending tracts, which would be your sensory, and autonomic tracts. It will also control consciousness and sleep. There are many brainstem centers here that project up to the cortex, which control basically consciousness. Then extending from the brainstem, there are many cranial nerve nuclei that extend out and basically supply different regions of the body, particularly the head and the face, but others extend into the body with regard to autonomic function. If we talk about the basic structure of the brainstem, we can divide it into two halves. We have a basilar section, which is more towards the front or ventral area. And then we have the tegmentum, which is the back half or the dorsal side of the brainstem. We also have a small region on top of the midbrain that we call the tectum, which contains the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. And here's just a drawing of those: the basilar section, the tegmentum, and the tectum up above. So just a basic question is, why can someone with a severe head injury, be it in the cerebral area, be in a persistent vegetative state, yet continue to live? In other words, they have heart, respiratory, and visceral functioning. And then conversely, why is damage to the upper cervical spine or brainstem so life-threatening? Well, basically, like we mentioned before, within the brainstem itself, we have lots of centers, particularly the reticular activating system, that project their neurons and neurotransmitters up to the cortex, which then control consciousness and sleep. So if those centers are cut off through a brain injury and can't project to the cortex, then we will get loss of consciousness. But yet, all the vital functioning in terms of respiration, heart rate, autonomic function, tend to all have centers in the brainstem which would still be intact. It's just those areas that control consciousness are cut off. Conversely, a damage to the brainstem or upper cervical region can have life-threatening consequences, because that does contain the centers for a lot of our vital functions, which we'll talk about at a later time. In the basic structure of the brain, we're looking at that basilar section, which is down here in the ventral part. You can generally think of that as being more motor in function. It has your descending tracts from the cortex, such as your cortical spinal tracts. It has cortical pontine tracts, cortical reticular tracts. There are some motor nuclei, particularly, one, the substantia nigra is in the midbrain. And there are then some of your pontine and reticular nuclei in this basilar section. Then we have some of our cerebellar tracts that are going to be progressing through this ventral section, though they tend to find their way more dorsally in order to get up to the cerebellum as well. However, we just generally kind of talk about the basilar section being more motor in function. Whereas we talk about the tegmentum, or the dorsal part of the brainstem, to be more sensory in function. We have lots of sensory nuclei, our sensory tracts, such as our medial lemniscus and spinal thalamic tracts, are going to be more in this area up here. We have our reticular formation, which then also is a diffuse set of nuclei that has general functions of giving the alert system, or alerting, or keeping consciousness up in the cortex, as we talked about before. In the tectum, which is that small part, the upper part or dorsal part in the midbrain, we'll have the superior inferior colliculus, and also in this section we have the periaqueductal gray and the cerebral aqueduct. It consists of this pretectal area, the superior and inferior colliculus, like I mentioned, which have to do with motor reflexes with the eye and reflexive head movements, also related to sound. And this is just a dorsal section of our midbrain. Here's our two thalami up here, so that's the thalamus, but here's the midbrain, superior colliculi, inferior colliculus. This would be the level of the pons, so on the dorsal side you don't see that big bulbous area of the pons. Also, in this section here, the cerebellum has been cut off, so these are then the cerebellar peduncles. Cerebral aqueduct coming down here into the fourth ventricle, and then down this part below this line is the medulla, and also there's a bit of the fourth ventricle here on the top side of the medulla. So this question is getting at, if an individual had a lesion in the ventral brainstem area on both sides, what would be the manifestation of their impairments? So this is the ventral section, like we talked about, which is going to be mostly motor in function. If both sides are impaired, and if there's a large area of infarction, that's going to lead to what's called locked-in syndrome. And these individuals are completely unable to move because they have damage to all the descending tracts. And the patient might only be able to communicate through eye movements. So in this case, the reticular activating system is working fine, thus they're conscious. However, they can't move. That's why it's called locked in. They are aware of what's going on, but they can't move anything, except perhaps a particular eye movement that might be left intact. And usually in those cases, they come up with a way of communicating through movements of the eye, which is just a very devastating kind of event to happen. So we'll stop here, and then we'll pick up and talk a little bit more about the introduction to the cranial nerves.